I'm a faculty member in the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I am director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA. I'm going to be moderating this session. We're going to be shifting from transforming transportation to transforming transit. So we're focusing in. And we have three panelists that are going to be talking to us this afternoon. It's going to be similar in format to the last one, where I'll start off by asking some questions, and then we'll shift to audience questions. Our three panelists are Kate Kigongo. She's manager of partnerships and innovative deployment at the Southern California Association of Governments, otherwise known as SCAG. Her work focuses on using technology, innovation, and pilot projects, which we heard about in the last session, to improve transportation, urban design, and sustainability outcomes for California. Our next speaker is Joshua Schank. He's the managing principal at InfraStrategies, where he leads a practice focused on innovation, strategic planning, and technology. He also, in the interest of full disclosure, happens to be a senior fellow in the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, as well as a research associate at the Mineta Transportation Institute. And third is Mark Tollefson. He's the Undersecretary of California State Transportation Agency. And in that role, he advises the CalSTA Secretary on issues, programs, and departments, and he oversees personnel, fiscal, administrative functions, and planning at the agency. So I'm excited to get going with this group. So first, Mark, I want to start with you and ask if you could tell us a little bit about the Transforming Transit Task Force, kind of what it entails, what its goals are, scope, a little bit, just so to get everyone on the same page.
Yeah, great. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk a little bit about what we're doing from a state perspective. But we've been tasked, and I've been honored to actually be the chair of our Transit Transformation Task Force work. So that came out of SB 125, which was part of this past year's budget. That was the bill that also authorized $5.1 billion to help support transit throughout the state. So part of that effort not only comes with regional plans being developed to spend those dollars, but also looking at the future. And that's really what the Transit Transformation Task Force effort is all about. So under that, we've had a couple meetings thus far. Our third meeting is going to be actually April 15th down in San Diego. We're trying to hit every region in the state, but we've really started by setting the stage of kind of what is the current status of transportation coming out of, or transit coming out of the pandemic, and where do we need to go from here? And one of the things that I'm really excited to talk, or to kind of talk with the experts that we have on that panel, is really about the future. We're really wanting unconstrained thinking about what does transit look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how do we create a sustainable kind of complement to our existing transportation structure. So with that, a few of the things that we're tasked with are looking at things such as fares, looking at schedule integration, looking at things such as safety and security, all the issues that I'm sure you've talked about earlier today, and kind of you experience as riders of transit. But also, how are we going to fund transit in the future? How can we, look at technology to help supplement our efforts? So it really it goes across the board into workforce issues. Some of what the previous panel was talking about, land use and how that contributes to our transit system. So it really is about that stage setting and thinking about the future. Obviously, we can't just spend our way out of this. We need to be more efficient with our systems, thinking about how it integrates with other modes. But we are really excited. It's going to be a daunting effort. We're going to have probably about 10 to 12 meetings with our collective group. We have a technical working group as well. And this all culminates with a report that's going to be due to the governor and the legislature in October of next year.
Okay, let me ask just a follow-up on that. So you are engaging a wide array of partners around the state, but it is a state initiative. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on California's role in public transit vis-a-vis the sort of other governmental agencies. So there's a clear federal role. The MPOs play a significant role in public transit. For municipal operators, the cities themselves play a significant role. So you have a lot of governmental actors in there. And, transit support is not new in California. I mean, in 1971, the Transportation Development Act was passed and started substantial supportive operations. Any thoughts on the contemplation of what the state role is in transit? So apart from what the task force will be working on in terms of do you see a waxing role, a steady one, a waning? How do you imagine this role looking ahead for the state of California in transit?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting from a transit perspective. We as a state are responsible for the highway system. We do participate in some of the JPAs with respect to intercity rail, but transit is really more of a local issue or a regional issue. From kind of my perspective, it's something where we really want to maintain partnerships and really think about how not only through the support through like the TDA as you mentioned, but how can we, possibly take more of a leadership role kind of through the task force and through some of those interactions, but how we can, create a more efficient system. We do have very ambitious statewide goals. I think as many of you are familiar with our scoping plan and where we need to be by 2045, we need to look at reducing vehicle miles traveled by 25%. We can't do that alone. It is going to take that partnership with all of our transit operators in the state. One of the interesting things, to me, is that as we've looked at some of the data, about 27% of all the trips in the state are 10 miles or greater. Those trips, though, really take into account about 75% of all of our VMT. So that is something where, from a state perspective, especially as we're thinking about, interregional, travel, that is where, we can step in and really think about ideas and approaches, working with a lot of our regional agencies about how we can plan for that.
So I just wanted to pick up on that comment about, and start to pull the other speakers in, the comment that you offered about we have ambitious goals for transit and we need to reduce VMT. So that is an ambitious goal for transit, and it entails significant changes in its use. But of course, there are, if we look at what's happening coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing that the demographics of transit use have shifted, in part because more affluent, educated riders have been moving away and not using it as much, so that transit is used more by people of color, more by immigrants, more by low-income riders over time. And one of the things that can happen is there's lower levels of auto ownership, and that increased transit use is increasing travel, it's increasing access, but it's not necessarily decreasing VMT. And so there's these twin goals, and I'd love to hear a little bit about providing your thoughts on kind of the paired, not just you, but the whole panel, the paired goal of providing accessibility, especially for those without, and the goal of trying to create a viable alternative to driving by private vehicles so that we can reduce the environmental footprint of the transportation system, which is enormous. Any thoughts on that? And turn to others.
Well, I mean, I think that transit and the state both really need to make a decision about that. I think it is one of the things that has plagued transit as long as I've been in the field, is that it is asked to do those two things that are not necessarily in conflict, but are not always working together. And as a result, it does neither of them very well. So it's asked in one respect, let's get people out of their cars and get onto transit. And then it's also asked to be a social service to help people who really need it the most. And the problem with those two goals is that when you have those two dual goals, you wind up softening how well you focus on each of them. And that's what we're seeing as the result of transit, right? Transit is not doing very well at all, as you mentioned, at getting people out of cars. It's going the opposite direction right now. But it's also not doing very well as a social service and providing better service to those who need it the most. And I think that the problem that we have, the reason that it gets confused, is that we live in a country where we see that New York exists, and we also see that Los Angeles exists. And in New York, those two goals are not necessarily in conflict, and they can work together. But in Los Angeles, they are in conflict. And so you've got federal and state structures that have to deal with very different types of cities that should really have very different types of goals for transit. And they all get thrown together, and that kind of obfuscates what you're trying to achieve. So I personally, when I work with transit agencies, try to get them to focus on one or the other as their primary goal, and then devote resources towards that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think transit and increasing transit is a tool to help. It's a tool in the toolbox of VMT reduction. SCAG takes an approach that, in order to reduce VMT, we can't just think about transit. It's also your multimodal network, it's your land use patterns, it's encouraging those transit-oriented communities. And that's not just something that you can flip a switch and see the changes like you can perhaps with some transit changes. Land use patterns take a long time to change. Housing takes a long time to develop. And as Jody said on the previous panel, Southern California as a region is varied in its land use, and most of it doesn't look like downtown Los Angeles or the city of Los Angeles or even the county. And so, transit is the tool, but we really have to think, and I think transportation agencies should be thinking about housing, because that is a way to drive more transit ridership. That's a way to achieve that 25% goal of VMT reduction.
And I would just agree with all of those points. I think, one of the challenges that we have is that, our transportation system is really built, designed in a way based on the land use decisions of decades ago, right? As we built the, interstate system, more and more people were kind of spread out outside of our downtowns, outside of our core. We aren't, New York, but at the same time, I think there are ways for us to, kind of really drive it, getting people, the option, right? And, where maybe you're not going to take every trip, in your single occupancy vehicle, but, kind of driving people closer to their daily destinations. And I think, from our agency's perspective, we do have a, really strong partnership with our Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, because transportation and housing are, linked together. It is something where it does take time. Transportation projects in general take time, right? So you don't see the immediate results that you would otherwise need to meet oftentimes our aggressive goals, but we do need to drive more people towards having those options, drive people closer to jobs, closer to transit, closer to daily destinations.
So let me pick up on that, a theme that's kind of come up quite a bit. This is about transforming transportation. We've heard a lot that these problems that are intersectional. The transportation issues are housing issues, that the transportation issues are environmental issues. Transportation issues also become social work issues, that these are all connected. And then we've also heard, kind of fairly, there's this problem of mission creep. So I'm left a little puzzled as to how we think about, if we're really talking about transforming transit, and we're starting to talk about changing the nature of metropolitan areas in terms of the way that they're developed, that San Francisco may look more like New York over time, that Los Angeles may look more like San Francisco over time. And that creates an environment where transit becomes more and more sort of woven into the fabric of travel. That does require mission creep, right? Because now we're talking about a lot of other elements other than operating buses and trains. I just wonder if you have some thoughts about, as we're thinking about transforming transit, how do you engage the other players involved in this in a way that allows you to have those transformative changes you're looking for?
Well, I'll echo what Sarah Jepson said on the previous panel, which is that the power of good planning allows you to assign responsibility for each element of the transformation. SCAG can't do it alone, Metro can't do it alone, the state can't do it alone. And so by, having a sort of equitable and inclusive planning process allows you to better define the roles and responsibilities to reach a shared goal. And so we might all agree on where we want to go, but a good plan will help us identify who needs to do what to get there.
Other thoughts or comments?
Well, I think one of the benefits of higher levels of government, like the state or the federal government, is that they can be the way that those things come together. And in many ways, that's because they can serve as the bad guy in this conversation, right? That's, I think, an underrated strategy for states and the federal government, is that it is much easier for a local official to be able to say, I got to do this or else we're not getting money from the state, or I got to do this or else we're not getting money from the feds, than it would be for them to just say, I think this is the right thing to do. And you see that play across all things like housing, right? We got that going on right now with the state and housing. People don't want to build housing at the local level. The state is forcing them to do it. And the same thing really should be happening with transit, which is that, and I'm not just talking about building transit, but I'm talking about the kind of transformation of transit that this task force or anyone else the state might want to take on. You got to decide, that task force needs to decide, what exactly is the thing that we want to have happen from transit? And if it's environmental, okay, that's fine. But if the environmental goal is what you're really after with transit, you've got a real task ahead of you of getting people to drive gas-powered vehicles less and to be on transit a lot more. And that requires a very different set of policies than if your goal is, well, okay, we just want to make sure that low-income people have access to more things, which requires a lot of things we've already been talking about, which is the marginal improvements of transit, the better cohesion, more frequent service, those types of things. So defining your goal is really important, and then allowing the states and the federal government to take some responsibility for pushing or incentivizing the localities to move in that direction.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. And I mean, one of the things that, kind of as you've probably heard our secretary, speak in the past, but at CalSTA, we, really have, four core pillars that, drive our work. So that's safety, equity, climate action, and economic prosperity. To your point, those are all
It's a lot of pillars.
lofty goals, right? And sometimes they don't, interact perfectly, with each other. So are you picking one or the other? How do you balance that? So I think from a state perspective, that is something that, is challenging, right? And, I think through the task force, we are going to hopefully kind of hear from practitioners, hear from experts about how we move forward. I mean, I think one of the things that we hear, quite a bit just on the surface, when we talk about, transit is, people want, safe, clean, convenient, options, right? That bleeds into a lot of other social issues as well, right? Some of the discussion earlier about housing and homelessness, those are issues where transit agencies are having to, actually act more kind of in kind of the social service aspect of things versus just the movement of people to where they need to be. So those are all, topics that we're going to grapple with. We don't have the, we don't have the answers just now. I mean, we have direction that we need to head, but it is going to be a big task to really, reimagine and rethink how, even the state interacts with our, local agencies and how we move forward to really drive that, if it's those 4 goals, 2 goals, 1 goal, it's just going to be a very difficult task.
Mm-hmm. So let me shift gears a little bit and turn to the way that we support transit. And I want to back up a little bit. We're kind of saying it's been a rough few years for public transit, and what are we going to do to turn things around? But if we look back the past 30 years, it's been a remarkable run for public transit in California. I travel around the country. People say, "What did you guys do?" I'm a college professor. I didn't do anything, but other people had a big effect on things. We've built a lot of transit capital all around the state. Los Angeles has done sort of an extraordinary job in sort of adding capacity, and it's not alone. San Diego, the Bay Area have all added a lot of transit capacity. So something has happened on that side. But I have had more than one transit executive tell me it's way easier for me to find the capital funding to build the next segment of the line than it is to find the O&M funding to operate and maintain it. That politically, people like to vote for things that can be the new shiny new thing, but less interest in spending the kind of money it takes to really operate it, to make it realize its full potential. So looking forward, we're looking at the precipice of a budget crisis in the coming year at the state level. We have federal pandemic relief funds are running out, and we have this dilemma that it tends to be easier to find capital than O&M funding. Can you tell us about your vision for what a more sustainable sort of fiscal future might be for a transformed transit? What it would take to realize? And I'm going to get to kind of the ridership goals in just a minute.
Yeah, I can maybe touch on that to start. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it is much easier to get funding for capital projects because, we can have ribbon cuttings and, people get excited over something new that they can touch and feel, right? When you're talking about, we're moving from 15-minute headways to 10-minute headways, right? That's great, but that's something that's hard to kind of celebrate, right? So I do think that is, kind of a real dilemma. But the whole reason why we have our Transit Transformation Task Force is to address just that issue, right? Where we have been very successful to continue to kind of build out our system, build capital, but the funding to operate and maintain, right? Coming out of the pandemic, the transit, kind of fiscal cliff, if you will, that we were facing. We were able to get a large infusion. I mentioned the $5.1 billion in the budget, which is capital, but also could be flexed for operations. That will only go so far. So we do need to think about the future. And part of this is, again, not just, if we need to increase transit by 2 times, does that mean we need 2 times the funding? No. But is funding a part of the equation? Absolutely, yes. But the one thing that I will say is that if we are more efficient with our system and if we are able to continue to drive up kind of ridership, that does help with our operations. That does help with our kind of funding stack to operate. And hopefully through that, we will be able to create a more sustainable system. But I won't sit here today and tell you that it's we can do this without looking at funding into the future. And those are the conversations that we're going to need to have over the next 12 to 18 months as we're working with our task force.
Other comments?
Well, I think how you fund transportation has a lot to do with what you wind up building, right? And that's often the problem that we run into. Yes, California has been successful in raising money to fund transportation. It's largely done that through sales tax measures and sales tax ballot measures. And it's much easier to sell the public on large capital funding projects than it is to sell them on the projects that might actually work to accomplish the larger goal that we care about. So, we started off by saying, we've been very successful in California. And when I travel around the country, people are always like, oh, it's so great. You guys have so much money for transit. And I'm like, yes. And we've built a lot of transit. But what has that achieved as far as the larger goal that we care about? The ridership of LA Metro and the ridership of as a percentage of the population in Los Angeles is lower than what it was previously as a per capita basis. It's not going up despite all of that huge capital investment. So again, I'm not saying that ridership is the goal, but if that's the goal, we're not achieving it. And so part of what has to happen is you have to, first of all, focus on what your goal is and think about how you're going to track and evaluate that goal. And the state and the feds do have to play a big role in that. And then focus on a funding source that will actually allow you to achieve that. And I don't think that sales tax measures at the ballot are really ever going to be that funding source, because you're not going to generate the kind of enthusiasm for the kind of funding we need for the kind of projects and improvements we need at the ballot box. But alternatively, there are other funding sources that are much scarier to elected officials. But if you can point out how they'll actually achieve the goals you care about, would be far more powerful, such as pricing the road system, better parking policies, trying to raise money through vehicle registration fees, all these things that scare the living daylights out of people, but would actually achieve the goals. I'm not saying that those are going to be easy to do or that that's the solution to all our problems. I'm saying that we have to be transparent about the fact that those options would have more power and could be employed, and we're choosing not to employ them, and instead we're going this route, and this is the result that we're getting.
Yeah, I've got 2 thoughts on this. The first is that I think, I've never worked at a transit agency, so I'm not going to speak to transit agency funding. But I have worked in local government, and local government, I think, holds the key to unlocking a new segment of ridership. And that's the local streets and local sidewalks for bus stops and dedicated bus lanes or multi-purpose dedicated lanes. I think transit agencies are important in solving the transit problem, of course, transit ridership problem and solving that challenge. But I think our local governments have a big responsibility, particularly to, one, improve the conditions for existing ridership, And then two, draw more people onto the system. And so, the quality of a bus stop and the bus shelter, the quality of the speed and reliability might not be, increased frequencies are great, but a dedicated bus lane that maybe the County Transportation Commission is not responsible for, that might be even greater. The second piece of this point is that I think we're going to find out with the passage of Measure HLA here in the city of Los Angeles, what happens when a measure is, a citizen-initiated measure with no financial support for it. We're going to see this play out in real time. And so, can we start to find efficiencies in the way that we improve our whole multimodal network, not just our transit features. So, I think local governments have a huge role to play in the success of increasing transit ridership.
Let me pick up on something that Kate has raised and Joshua in a slightly different way. We heard earlier from the earlier panel that, well, we'll get general agreement on goals and objectives. And as we move kind of down to more specificity until we're actually talking about real trade-offs or real project, that's where concerns arise. And I want to kind of raise a couple of questions. We heard earlier on that we need to create environments where transit is attractive and viable for a large share of trips, references to New York, things like that. It's local governments that are, ultimately controlling the land that those transit connects to, making decisions, and we talked about how the state is intervening more. And we also have heard allusions earlier to the question of managing automobiles in some way. And that I'm willing to submit that this is a fabulous facility. And a lot of you very quietly said, oh yeah, and it has free parking too. And I bet that changed the mode split to here downtown than it would to many other locations. So we have this issue where we talk about, well, we're going to change the infrastructure, not building more lanes, for example, but we don't really want to manage driving itself. And that's sort of really difficult. So we're dancing around the edges. So we've got lots of pushback on creating the kind of urban environments where transit thrives, and lots of pushback on actually managing driving itself. And yet, I'm going to then turn to what's really going to take to we're talking about 5 times increase in transit use. But I'd like you to kind of reflect on what it might mean to really, really manage things in ways that creates environments where walking, biking, and transit become maybe the first choice rather than a fallback.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to step in. I think what you're getting at is that it will take a really transformational set of policies in order to do that. And I agree with that. And I think that it's going to take a set of policies that is focused on how we can create an environment, not just where we have more incentives to use transit, like through pricing, et cetera, but where those policy changes also benefit the vast majority of people who are driving. So you have to have it in both areas, because if you just focus on, we're going to take away lanes of traffic and we're going to charge pricing, and well, that's really not very realistic. You've got an entire state set up around cars being cheap and plentiful places to park, but you can start making those types of changes. And I think the way that happens, the way that you get pricing on the roads and pricing that actually makes sense, is by showing people the cost of the status quo more transparently. That's always the place where I feel like we fall down, right? I love this story of when I was a kid, my parents had this rule that they would say, if they had a fight, that no always wins in the fight. And so that meant that whoever was arguing against action would win by default if they couldn't agree. And of course, my parents got divorced, so that's kind of key component of the story. But my other point is
Where is this going,
Yes.
Joshua?
That is kind of a model for exactly how our public policy operates, which is that no always wins. And no always wins because it's always easier for electeds to say, well, at least we're not changing what we have. And there is a huge cost to maintaining the status quo. There's a huge cost to keeping what we have. We're all experiencing it. It's happening right now with climate change. It is happening right now with the fact that low-income people have far worse access to things than everyone who has a car or access to a car. So those problems are not being shoved in the face of elected officials nearly as much as they should be in order for us to generate the kind of support that would be necessary to get the kind of policies you're talking about around managing the automobile.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. It's interesting when we think about, kind of our climate policies, in the state. And, we've been really successful to have very ambitious, very, kind of set timelines in which we need to, meet certain goals. The one thing that's interesting is with, transportation being, more than 50% of all our GHG in the state, depending on how you slice it, a lot of our funding decisions and other kind of, I guess, applications and programs that we develop, are focused on other areas. And to the point where, I think when we talk about, transit, talk about, pricing a, highway system, for example, the status quo is just so much easier. It's, easier to kind of move in directions of, protecting natural working lands. It's easier, and I guess I won't say it's easier, but, when we talk about building decarbonization, all of those things are great. But if you really want to, kind of have the bang for your buck, we really do need to tackle this transportation issue. But I think it is just politically always challenging, right? Especially if you're thinking about, just the convenience of the single occupancy vehicle. And then if you start taking away a lane or pricing a lane that otherwise provided free access, how do you think about equity as it comes into play there? Where are you just allowing the wealthy to be able to kind of move freely, and then everyone else who's traveling very large distances because of our kind of housing and jobs imbalance, are stuck in congestion. So I think there's a lot of, kind of issues that come with that are very hard to tackle. But I do think that we need to start getting to a point where we are putting that kind of in the forefront as to, kind of what the situation really is on the ground. And if we do want to meet these ambitious goals, we can play around the edges, but there are some real things that we need to tackle.
I'll offer a pilot vision. I like pilot projects. I think they're good ways to figure out how to do things, not necessarily what to do, but how to get it done. I think Jacob mentioned the games, our major events that are coming to Southern California. That is an opportunity for us to pilot pricing. We know we need sort of wholesale changes in the way that we fund our transportation system and the move to ZEV, adoption. But when it comes to say pricing parking, that in conjunction with improvements in the transit system, there's an opportunity to study and to understand how to do that statewide. We've got the Olympics, we've got the World Cup, we'll have Super Bowls in the future, these major events where we may be able to see behavior change based on how well we do pricing the system.
So I'd like to, that was where I was going to go. I thank you for opening that door, is that we do have this major event coming up, and politically that can be whether it's a meaningful one or just an artifice, it's a way of focusing attention around changes. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It could be technology, it could be operational, it could be governmental, on what are 2 or 3 things that really stand out for you that need to happen to transform transit? And this is kind of wide open.
Yeah, and I guess in the context of large scale events like the Olympics, as we build towards that, I think, we are able to pilot certain things. And I think that is one of the things that I'm hoping comes out of, LA 28 is really a kind of long lasting change, right? What is the legacy of the games going to be? If we're thinking about a car free games where people are going to mobility hubs and having to take transit into venues, right? That's something that I think, can be, long lasting, especially in an area like Los Angeles where you have large events all the time. One of the things that's interesting, so I just met with a delegation from Noord-Holland in the Netherlands, and they had a huge Formula One, race. And what they were sharing is that as they, were planning for this event, they knew they didn't have the infrastructure to support 300,000, kind of vehicles, or to support 300,000 people coming for a weekend, 100,000+, a day. So they really, focused on how are we going to get people from point A to point B, and only 2% of all the attendees actually came by single occupancy vehicle, which was incredible. Obviously,
And that was the Formula One drivers, right?
yeah, right. Yeah, there you go. But it was really interesting. And one of the things that, as we think about just transit, think about our, light rail systems, our bus systems. But one of the things there, and obviously the Netherlands has a huge, bike culture. But it was really interesting that, about 40,000 of those trips in a given day were done by bike, right? And they have the infrastructure to support that. But it's just, one of those things that we should also, think about, as we're looking at, a multimodal approach, and definitely some things that we can start to pilot again to, get people comfortable with those other modes, whether or not it's going to be their mode of transportation every single day, but even to large scale events. I mean, that would be a lasting impact in the region. And then a couple other things that are just, things that we can do in the near term as we approach, an event like, the 28 games. Looking from a state perspective, it's things like, bus on shoulder. Are there, different opportunities for us to really, kind of utilize our system in a different way? A lot of that, gets down to the local level as well, thinking about transit priority. And then another thing that's, interesting is just how do we move people around, and just based on our changing, commute patterns, looking at, providing those, options throughout the day, right? To pick up a number of the people who are, not only relying on transit, but others, who, maybe are taking those day trips where, it'd otherwise be a car trip that they could, hop on a bus or hop on transit. And sorry, I know we're, close on time, but, I'm just even thinking about my trip today, right? I flew into the Burbank airport, and it was, would have been so much easier to just, call an Uber or call a Lyft, right? It's just step out, of the airport, boom, right there. It took me a little minute to figure out, okay, where do I actually catch the bus? Okay, is the bus going to be here on time? Can I get here on time doing transfers? So how do we make our transit systems, more connected and less complicated? Wayfinding, all of those pieces are going to be important. But I will stop there because I know I want to get to our other panelists.
I think the major events have, the benefit of bringing new riders onto the system for maybe the first time. And so providing a good experience with the speed, the reliability, but also the sort of invisible technology that improves that experience. So you mentioned, transit priority. SCAG is exploring some pilot projects with the California Integrated Travel Project to move towards open loop fare payment adoption for some of our agencies in Southern California. And so I think the best innovation, the best technology is one that nobody sees. And, if we can make fare payments as easy as tapping a card, or, tapping your phone or your watch, physical or digital, that kind of experience will encourage people to come. I think will encourage people to come onto the system again and try it if they've had a positive experience.
I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a contrarian view on this. I'm kind of a skeptic that culture is the issue when it comes to people riding transit. And I've heard that ever since I moved to LA. People are, coming from the East Coast, and people are like, well, how are you going to change the culture? Everyone in LA is loves their car, and they're never going to change that. And I don't think it has anything to do with culture. I think it has to do with people have invested in cars and in homes and in a society that is built around those decisions. And you can reverse that, but it is not an issue of getting people to realize the benefits of a transit system that is largely substandard and doesn't compare in any way to having a car when it comes to trying to get where you want to go. So your example today, Mark, is a great example. Like, you, a transit professional, tried your best and it still was really difficult to accomplish what you wanted to, the vast majority of people out there couldn't care less about the things you talked about. And we've all been to Ciclavia, and we all know how wonderful it is when there are no cars on the street. And we've all ridden the train on the occasional time to go to the airport or to go to the, not in this city, but in other places, and to go to the stadiums. And we know that can be a wonderful experience. That doesn't then cause people to go home and sell their single family home and sell their car and move to the downtown area and live a life without a car. That's not how the people's minds work. They respond to incentives, and the incentives have to be there for them to live a different lifestyle, or they're going to continue to live the lifestyle that gives them the best option right now, which is still focused on cars.
And one thing that I was just going to add to that is, one of the struggles I think we always have is that, we'd love to, kind of hit the home run with respect to, getting people to completely give up their, single family vehicle and kind of change their lifestyle, right? That probably isn't going to happen, but how can we think about opportunities where someone may decide, okay, 20% of my trips, I'm going to actually take another mode, right? Allowing, people to feel safe when they're biking from point A to point B, making, those connections more convenient, right? Where, I think it was, I admit it was challenging for me to figure out how to get from Burbank Airport to LA Union Station to then walk over here, right? And just the uncertainty that comes with that sometime where, you hop in your car, you don't have to think, you just go. I mean, back in, the day, you'd have to grab your Thomas guide, or you'd have to, go to MapQuest, right? Print out where you're going to go. Now you just pull it up on your phone. It'll tell you the best route to go. It'll tell you pretty much, on point, hey, if I leave now, I'm going to get here by this time. Today I had that uncertainty of, hey, I'm going to go use transit. I'm going to, take the Burbank bus. I'm going to connect to the metro. I'm going to get here. But, I missed one, kind of slight connection, right? It's where I was going to be here probably 30 minutes earlier. I missed it. And now, ended up getting here. I mean, it was, once you're on, it's convenient. It's great. But it is that, just kind of anxiety, I think, that, gets created. And I just always think about, hey, if, my mom was faced with a situation of getting, out of the airport, figuring out where to go, or you could just hop on and get a taxi or an Uber, she would probably choose the easier route. We don't make it that seamless and easy to ride transit. And that's something that hopefully we can improve, and hopefully some of the things that, we can work with our transit agencies on, work on best practices through our task force and things like Cal ITP, that, just a one tap kind of program.
Okay, we're going to turn to questions. You want to make a quick comment while you're,
just to
Amy,
pick
if you
up
can cue those up.
Oh yeah, the final thing on this, just if that's true, and I agree with you, like you can shift people, you can make those differences, but that means that these big events like the Olympics should not be seen as an opportunity to change culture. They should be seen as an opportunity for permanent changes to the transportation system. So if we're going to put in BRT lanes because of the Olympics and force people not, well, we got to make sure those BRT lanes stay there after the Olympics. So we're going to create a universal basic mobility pilot for the Olympics. Let's make sure that stays there after. Like those things can't just be, hey, let's show people. It's got to be, this is the new real reality.
Last word.
I guess my last point is that, taking transit can be difficult, but driving is also really difficult. And so, to relate back to the previous panel, the way we communicate and message that, I think there's a huge opportunity. Even if you can't change the whole culture, if we can just get some people to understand that transit is an option and make it suck a little less, then we may hit that 25% increase in or decrease in VMT.
I pray that doesn't get onto a t-shirt after this event. Okay, Amy.
And I promise Amy told me it was voted. It wasn't because I was sitting here. So picking up on kind of one of the themes from the last panel and kind of how do we, subtract and kind of be strategic in what we're doing. I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are about kind of project selection and use of investments. Transit agencies have a lot of shiny projects that are pushed by, that are politically popular, but might be outside of kind of the core things. You know, we're seeing that in, you know, the gondola project or in other things kind of around some of our, you know, some of our major kind of major attractors for the Olympics and things like that. So just kind of thoughts about how can transit projects, you know, weigh the kind of the core priorities and political pressures.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, from a state perspective, a lot of, I guess I would say the challenge that we always have is that, you know, we here in California, there's just a lot of, you know, kind of push for local control and local decision making. And I think there's, you know, that makes sense in a lot of ways, right? You know, at the local level, you know, kind of what your, you know, community's needs are. But at the same time, that does sometimes lead to, you know, some of those political, you know, type decisions. But I think from a state perspective, as we, you know, kind of roll out our programs, you know, as we think about, you know, kind of those core four, you know, pillars that I talked about, you know, how can we, you know, really think about those projects that are the highest and best use of a very limited pool of funds. I think we've done a much better job through like our Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program over the years in terms of the types of projects that move forward. The other thing that's always interesting to me is how do you balance some of the needs in, you know, like a community like Los Angeles or, you know, some of the more rural communities where, you know, if you're talking about a $2 million, you know, project in, you know, more rural community, the impact that that truly has on, you know, on the community and the riders as compared to, you know, a project here, which may, you know, $2 million, you would need 20 million, 200 million, right? So I think those are just things, you know, for us to think about, but I'd love to hear the perspective from the rest of the panel.
Yeah, at SCAG, we're leading a process of sort of federal funding program project selection for the first time, or we're doing a new process for the first time. In the past, for the CMAQ SDBG funding, county transportation commission solicited projects, submitted that to SCAG, and we sort of approved those for federal funding. We received guidance from the federal government that we needed to have a competitive selection process. And with the addition of the carbon reduction program, a new federal funding source for transportation projects, we've sort of done a wholesale rethinking of how we select programs for funding. We've created new guidelines, new calls for projects. We've initiated new review processes in-house. And at the end of this month, we'll close our project applications, our application window, and go through a 30-person review panel for over 70, 75 projects that we anticipate receiving, and select, you know, a very large, a large portfolio of priorities. And, you know, that process of creating guidelines and working with the counties and working with our regional council helps us to refine the projects that come in, and then we can select projects that actually meet our plan's goals and that help advance our climate, our equity, our air quality improvement measures. And so this is, I don't have an answer on how we're going to, you know, what the outcome of that will be, but I think it's a small change in Southern California project selection for these 3 funding programs that could have big consequences for the way that we decide what our priorities are. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I agree with Kate that the key is having specific goals and metrics to evaluate how well projects are achieving those goals. The reason that we have a lot of projects that are funded that are not necessarily achieving any of those goals, I would place more of the blame actually at the state and federal level than I would at the local level. If localities want to tax themselves, I'm not a big fan of direct democracy, but if you want to tax yourself to build large land cruises across the county, then you go ahead and do that. The question is, why are the states and feds pitching in for projects like that? What is the interest of the federal government in building light rail lines that very few people are going to ride? I would say not much, but they still do it. And so a lot of those policy changes need to occur from the top down. Projects like the gondola project are actually the exception to this, since it's a privately funded project that will take no public money. And those types of projects are strongly discouraged by the public entities themselves. And in fact, that's one of the bigger issues, is that we have very few, there's a couple of high-speed rail projects and the gondola project, a couple others, very few privately funded transportation projects in this country, because for some reason we have decided that people can't make money off of building public transportation. And that's not necessarily true. If you allow them to do the land use development that goes along with it and make money off the housing, then they can actually build public transportation. So part of it is also opening the door to those private funding sources and allowing that to happen.
Okay, I'm gonna move. Yeah.
We have an anonymous question, so I'll field it again. So Paris is a city that in 10 years has made great strides in transportation and green infrastructure. How much or how little are Southern California transportation people looking to Paris for inspiration and guidance?
Take turns. Don't all jump in right away.
Yeah. Paris, I was fortunate enough to be there last summer and saw a lot of the construction and a lot of the improvements to their transportation system since the time I visited prior. Paris doesn't look like Southern California, and Paris has a very well-established regional transportation network that functions very differently than that of Southern California. It may be possible to take some of the great ideas from downtown or, of Paris and apply those to downtown LA and to Long Beach and to Santa Monica and to Anaheim, places that, major event centers. But the reality is that Paris doesn't, the land use pattern of Paris is vastly different from Southern California. And so it's a little bit of apples and oranges to compare the two.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I would just chime in, kind of reiterate something that Emma said on the last panel, which is that leadership does play a big role. The mayor of Paris has taken on the suburban interests around Paris. And now that's easier for her to do because they don't elect her. But nonetheless, she did take that on and getting screamed at from all sides about what she's done to that city, about how she's essentially anti-car, and she's done it. And she's okay with that, maybe because she's not angling to be the prime minister. I don't know. But having strong leadership that is not necessarily focused on achieving the next political office, but is instead just focused on achieving results locally, makes a huge difference in trying to get somewhere.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And I mean, we do look to a lot of other cities, in terms of, or other, countries even, for best practices, and whether or not that completely translates, but I do think there's a lot of ideas that can come from those discussions we have with others. One of the things that I will say, and back to one of Joshua's comments earlier, I do think the state can play a role to help give local electeds, or even our state legislature, some cover in terms of where we need to go, hard decisions that we need to make. So that is something that, as we move forward, and again, pushing some of our more ambitious, and kind of going back to like our climate goals, for example, or even how we think about now under the Transportation Agency, having our climate action plan for transportation infrastructure, that's to help drive our decisions, with our limited, transportation funds that are available. That does give some cover to think about projects differently, and some of those projects that maybe have been in development for the past decade or so, how we can maybe rethink those, reimagine those projects to still meet the goals, but maybe in a slightly different way.
So why don't we have one final question? We're going to ask for sort of rapid fire responses from all three of you. So you should think of a question that enables a quick response. So.
Well, okay. Should I go for it, Amy? Okay. So I'm Yu Hung. I'm a PhD student at UCLA. My question is this. We've talked a lot about localism and local governance of transit, but at the very beginning of the panel, Mark mentioned that actually interregional trips are of some significant interest and concern. And the only real interregional body in the state is the state itself. So you mentioned that beyond the rail, the JPAs, the state doesn't really intervene in interregional trips, but it's very difficult for private operators because they've got to compete against the Amtrak service, and for Amtrak to provide adequate service when they're restricted in the service they can provide. So we end up in this unhappy medium where we don't really have great interregional service, which provides an alternative to the single occupancy vehicle. So, what's the strategy here? Like, what are we trying to do with our interregional transit service that can help replace those long distance trips?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'll try to be brief here. But one of the things that are through the task force, we are looking to really kind of drive at some of those ideas. We've been called upon, in a number of ways, to take like a larger leadership role in the Los San corridor that goes from the border down in San Diego up to San Luis Obispo, and how can the state really kind of work through a number of the different kind of regional entities that oftentimes have differing opinions of kind of what needs to be done in the corridor, and how can the state step in to help guide, help prioritize. So those are things that we're looking at. I think really from a state perspective, our levers are really through policy to drive things in addition to funding. But those are some conversations that we're starting to kind of have more of, that we hope will come out of this task force in terms of our overall recommendations come next year.
I think, paying attention to sort of three agencies, you mentioned the Los San corridor. That's a great opportunity for sort of Southern California regional connectivity. Metrolink as our regional transportation agency here primarily serves as commuter rail. I think if we reimagine what Metrolink could be, we could see a different kind of Southern California. And then, our sort of out of state region in Las Vegas, I'm just personally very interested in seeing how the introduction of Brightline to Rancho Cucamonga and what that does to sort of the eastern LA counties and western San Bernardino County. We don't see that kind of private rail investment very often. And so I just think it's just something to watch for the future.
I'll tell you a little secret about intercity transportation, which I happened to learn a million years ago when I wrote my master's thesis, which is that the success of intercity rail depends entirely on the robustness of the transit network at the destinations you're going to. So in other words, if you don't have good transit networks, then your high-speed rail system is not going to mean anything, because people are going to have to get a car when they get to their destination. They're going to have to use cars when they get to the destination. So bringing it all around, if we don't transform transit, we're not going to be able to transform intercity transportation either. So I would focus on the transit stuff first and get to intercity second.
Okay. All right. Please join me in thanking our panel. Welcoming us to the end and thanking our panelists.